This is the story of the marvelous Marblehead men who saved the American Revolution 3 times. Just about the time the American Revolution was picking up steam after the official Declaration of Independence in 1776, it nearly came to a screeching halt that same year. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. Every time George Washington was out of options, he called on the same crew, the Marblehead men, who swooped in, saved the day, and gave the Revolution another chance to fight. Marblehead, Massachusetts was a small rock of a town just north of Boston, extending on a peninsula into the Atlantic Ocean. It was a town shaped by the sea, with an economy dependent on fishing, trade, shipbuilding, and privateering. Life there was physically demanding and often dangerous. But Marblehead had something else that set it apart. Marblehead was an ethnically diverse community. Black sailors, both free and enslaved, were common in New England ports. Native American men worked the docks and served aboard ships. Marblehead was not free of prejudice, but it was shaped by practical cooperation. On the sea, in a storm, skill was all that mattered. Not race, not status, pure skill. You trusted the men beside you because your life depended on it. And Marblehead was where the best sailors gathered. Trade was good, and Marblehead boasted some of the wealthiest colonies of the day. Life was good until it wasn't. If you recall, Massachusetts was the first colony that King George shut down in response to the growing protests against taxes, and in particular to the Boston Tea Party of 1774. The intolerable acts, sometimes referred to as the insufferable acts or coercive acts, were a series of punitive laws passed by the British Parliament, one of which closed Boston Harbor, causing Marblehead's thriving economy, based on fishing and trade, to collapse. Marblehead quickly dropped from wealth to crushing poverty. In response, Marblehead dove headfirst into rebellion. In 1774, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress directed towns to organize militia, Minutemen who could be ready at a moment's notice to defend the safety of their neighbors. Marblehead already had an active militia made up of Marblehead sailors and fishermen that was just as diverse as that community. Roughly one-third of its members were described in military records as having a, quote, dark complexion. While blacks were turned away from service in other colonies, they were welcomed and embraced in Marblehead. As sailors, race was irrelevant. The men's lives depended on trusting each other and instantly obeying orders. The Marblehead militia quickly became known for its skill and discipline that surpassed some of the more inexperienced militias. These sailors and fishermen were used to hard physical work and discipline. Combine that with righteous anger, and they adapted well to serving in the militia. Virtually every able-bodied man in Marblehead, plus nearby Salem and Beverly, had joined the Marblehead Regiment, then known as the 14th Continental Regiment, by January 1775. When it joined the Continental Army, it was known as the 21st Massachusetts Regiment. But to all who knew of them, they remained respectfully the Marblehead men. According to the Essex Gazette at the time, the Marblehead militia drilled 3 or 4 times a week. They hired a tutor in military history, a fencing master taught them the use of the small and broad sword, and a former British Army sergeant taught them the finer arts of war. The Continental Army didn't have proper uniforms in 1775. Soldiers generally wore their civilian clothing. The Marblehead men dressed like sailors, with their distinctive blue jackets, vests, white wide-bottomed trousers, leather boots, and wool caps or tarred wide-brimmed hats that repelled water. They were well supplied. They'd raided the HMS Lively in early February, which provided them most of their weapons and powder. John Glover was a successful and wealthy Marblehead fisherman and merchant with a slew of ships. He was more than ready to push back against the British oppression that had impressed his sailors into service and regularly searched his ships without warrants. Well known and respected, Glover was a recognizable figure in Marblehead. He dressed elegantly and always carried two silver pistols and a Scottish broadsword. He had joined the Marblehead militia early in 1759. He worked closely with Samuel Adams and John Hancock and served on the Committee of Correspondence and other colonial committees. He earned a commission as lieutenant colonel and took command of his Marblehead Regiment, soon numbered over 500. In the summer of 1775, George Washington decided the Continental Army needed a naval presence. He turned to his friend John Glover, who outfitted his favorite 78-ton schooner, the Hannah, named after his wife, as a naval ship. Washington then put Glover in charge of a small fleet, including the Franklin, Hancock, Lee, and Warren in the fall of 1775. Its mission was to disrupt British supply lines and capture much-needed arms and supplies. Next, Washington put the Marblehead Regiment in charge of fortifying and defending Beverly Harbor, which became the base for Washington's Navy. Not everyone approved of the ethnic diversity of the Marbleheaders. This was a time when black men were generally denied acceptance into the Continental Army. One officer from Pennsylvania complained that the presence of African American soldiers in Glover's regiment had, in his words, quote, a disagreeable, degrading effect. However, General John Thomas, commander of the Massachusetts troops at Roxbury, wrote, "We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general as equally serviceable with other men for fatigue, and in action many of them have proved themselves brave." Washington went back and forth with the Continental Congress about this for over a year. First, flat no. Then he said, well, if they're free men. Finally, he wrote the Continental Congress and said, it's come to my attention that black men are already serving well in the military. So, Washington may have been conflicted about the Army as a whole, but he had no such conflict about the Marblehead men. He accepted, no, respected the Marbleheaders, literally putting his life into their hands. That respect was well deserved, as you'll see. The first save, the East River, August 1776. By August of 1776, only a month after the big declaration, the Revolution was hanging by a thread. After a string of losses, the Continental Army had been badly defeated at the Battle of Long Island. To make matters worse, Washington's forces were trapped in Brooklyn Heights, pinned against the East River, with the British and Hessian troops closing in. If the British attacked, the army would be destroyed. Washington knew it. On the stormy night of August the 29th, he made a desperate decision. The entire army, nearly 9,000 men, along with horses, artillery, and supplies, would make their escape across the mile-wide river under cover of darkness. It was daring, it was risky, it was a bit nuts. This would be one of the most dangerous maneuvers in warfare. How could they pull off such a feat? Major Benjamin Talmadge, who was there, later wrote that moving such a force across a river a full mile wide with a rapid current in the face of a victorious enemy seemed to present the most formidable obstacles. In a letter to John Hancock, Washington wrote, I am sensible a retreating army is encircled with difficulties, but when the fate of America may be at stake, I cannot think it safe or wise to adopt a different system. Who could Washington trust to get his 9,000 men, artillery, horses, and supplies across the mile-wide river under cover of darkness? Washington knew his only chance for success was the Marblehead men. He reached out to Glover, who quickly put a plan together for the daring escape, involving commandeering every available boat down the river from the British, ferry boats, sailboats, cargo boats. As darkness deepened, the Marblehead men moved into position. Boats were loaded and unloaded in silence. No drums, no shouting, no lights, only the quiet splash of boats slipping into the water. They worked through the night in pelting rain and thrashing wind from the storm. The storm drowned out much of their activity, but they still had to be careful and quiet. British ships were anchored close enough that one loud sound could betray them. The first crossings did not carry soldiers. They carried equipment and horses that could not be abandoned. Washington had an ulterior motive. By moving the weapons and supplies first, any soldiers who refused to cross would be left helpless when the Hessians moved in. No one wanted to be left behind. The Marblehead men took their places at the oars. They rowed in silence. They could not shout instructions or warnings, but they didn't need to. They knew what they needed to do. They focused on the work as the oars sliced into the dark water again and again, their hands already raw from the salt and wet wood, their shoulders burning with every pull, the current and harsh winds fighting them as if they were commanded by the British. When they reached the other side, they quickly unloaded and quietly headed back for another load. They didn't count the crossings. There was no time for that. Only the rhythm, push, pull, slide, breathe again. Every stroke meant another man saved, another chance for the army to live. Dawn was coming. The enemy was close. A sliver of light could give them away. And then something extraordinary happened. A thick fog rolled in from the river, growing heavier by the hour. Visibility was so poor, British sentries could not see the water, much less the escaping Americans. Washington refused to leave until nearly the last boat had crossed. The crossing took 13 hours, non-stop work with no rest for the Marblehead men. The next morning, when the fog finally lifted, the British troops stared in disbelief. The American army was gone. Not a single life had been lost in the crossing. Without that night, without the Marblehead men at the oars, the revolution likely would have ended in August of 1776. The second save, Pell's Point. By October 1776, and after more defeats, Washington was attempting to retreat and regroup. General Howe, boo, and his British amphibious forces landed at Pell's Point, New York, 4,000 men strong, threatening to trap Washington and his army again. Glover spotted the threat first. Knowing that the enemy would be coming up Split Rock Road, Glover, without waiting for orders, took advantage of the stone walls running along each side and crossing the fields. He positioned his force of 750 soldiers in a staggered position behind the natural stone wall formations. As the British advanced, Marblehead men rose, fired, and retreated behind the next wall. The British charged ahead, only to face fire at point-blank range from concealed Marbleheaders behind every wall. It was devastating for the British. The Marblehead men managed to delay this force that was nearly 5 times their size. As the British overran each position, the Marblehead troops fell back and reorganized behind the next wall. After several such attacks, the British retreated. They didn't know what was happening and believed they faced a much larger force than they did. The Marblehead men gave Washington the time he needed to escape once again. The third save, Christmas 1776. I'm sure you recognize this famous painting by German immigrant Emanuel Lutz. The New York Evening Mirror called it, quote, the grandest, most majestic, and most effective painting ever exhibited in America, end quote. But who is that guy? People noticed, and some for the first time learned of the contributions of African slaves and free men to the cause of liberty. Do you know the story behind the painting? By December, the Continental Army was unraveling. Washington's forces had depleted from tens of thousands to just a few thousand. Men were barefoot, dressed in tatters, freezing from the cold. Food was scarce. They fought sickness, and they'd faced defeat after defeat. Enlistments were about to expire. Washington knew that much of his army would abandon the cause rather than reenlist. Washington wrote privately to his brother that he feared, quote, the game is pretty near up. So he gambled everything on one last Hail Mary move. Winter was a time of rest. Wars paused. British General Howe had given up on a surefire attempt to capture Washington and his forces because it was winter and it just wasn't done. But Washington didn't play by the same rules. Washington was desperate and determined. He planned a surprise attack on the Hessian troops camped at Trenton on Christmas Day. But first, the Americans had to cross the Delaware River to reach them. in the middle of winter, in the middle of the night, across a river choked with ice, during a violent blizzard and howling nor'easter. Most of the soldiers could not swim. Falling into the river meant certain death. How on earth could they pull this off? Washington met with John Glover. "Can we do this?" he asked. Glover replied simply, "Not to be bothered with that, sir. My boys can handle it." And they did. Once again, the Marblehead men came to the rescue. They gathered every boat they could find, flat-bottomed ferries and Dunham boats 40 to 50 feet long and as wide as 12 feet, and they got to work. An officer wrote in his diary, "It will be a terrible night for the soldiers who have no shoes, but I have not heard a man complain. They are ready to suffer any hardship and die rather than give up their liberty." Washington was worried. He later wrote, "As I was certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered and harassed on repassing the river, I determined to push on at all events." An officer watching Washington had a different perspective. He wrote, "I have never seen Washington so determined as he is now. He is calm and collected." Under the command of Colonel Henry Knox, the Marblehead men ferried over the river 2,400 soldiers, 18 cannons, 50 horses, and enough ammunition for the coming battle. The 6-pounder cannons weighed as much as 1,750 pounds. Wind battered the boats. Water splashed and froze where it landed. The men hacked a path through floating slabs of ice to get the boats across. There was fear, doubt. They had lost their advantage of attacking at dawn. John Greenwood, a soldier who crossed that night, later recalled, "During the whole night it alternately hailed, rained, snowed, and blew tremendously." Once everyone was safely across the river, the army had to march 9 miles, 4 hours through the blizzard to get to Trenton, leaving bloody footprints along their path. The 1,380 Hessians at Trenton had heard from a spy that the Americans were planning an attack, but they dismissed the idea. It was too crazy to even consider. As the army marched, Glover realized that a bridge south of town could allow the Hessians to escape. So he acted without orders again, took his men, and seized the bridge, cutting off a possible retreat. 3 hours behind schedule, the Continental Army still had the element of surprise on their side and soundly defeated the Hessians. Then, exhausted, soaked, half frozen, the army marched the 9 miles back to their boats. The Marblehead men then ferried the army, horses, and cannons back across the river, this time with an additional 900 Hessian prisoners. The Americans had lost 2 soldiers to the cold, frozen to death, and had just 5 wounded. Henry Knox wrote, "Perseverance accomplished what at first seemed impossible." The watchword that night had been simple: victory or death. Victory is what the Americans delivered, with a lot of help from Marblehead. This victory turned things around. Thanks to stirring words from George Washington and Thomas Paine, "These are the times that try men's souls," many of the soldiers re-enlisted. America was back on track. And, well, you know the rest. Despite Washington's offer of a bounty for 6 more weeks of service, only a handful of Marblehead sailor soldiers stayed in the Army on January 1st, 1777. They had done more in a few years than anyone could have imagined. The majority returned home to Marblehead, and many became privateers for the Continental Navy. The Marblehead privateers played a key role in capturing more than 3,000 British vessels during the rest of the war. For many black veterans, their future remained uncertain. Promises of freedom after the war were honored for some, but not for others. Romeo Smith was enslaved and was promised freedom in exchange for 3 years of service. He fulfilled his side of the promise, but after the war, his freedom was threatened. It took a formal certificate of freedom signed by Henry Knox, warning that anyone attempting to enslave him again would face, quote, "the severest penalty of the law and the indignation of heaven." Asaph Hale served in the Marblehead Regiment and is recognized as one of the men who rode George Washington and the Continental Army across the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, a critical action for the surprise attack on Trenton. Joseph Brown wrote that he served just over 10 months due to his master's, quote, promising his liberty if he would faithfully serve out his master's son's time. Brown then stated that he did so and received his liberty. He was a success story, living as a free man in Marblehead after the war, married to Lucretia. Together they owned their own home and operated a popular tavern. Cato Prince was born in Africa and enslaved as a child. He lived in Marblehead for decades and served honorably for a pension in 1818. Officials described him repeatedly as, quote, infirm, unable to do any kind of work, and supported by charity. John Glover, the leader of the Marblehead Men, continued his service, eventually became a brigadier general in the Continental Army. He tried to retire, though Washington convinced him to stay. After Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, Glover retired from the Army. He returned to Marblehead, bought a farm, and remarried. He served 6 terms as a town selectman and was a delegate to the state convention that ratified the U.S. Constitution. He also served 2 terms in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. John Glover died January 30th, 1797. Marblehead, Massachusetts became a symbol of the revolutionary spirit. In 1784, the Marquis de Lafayette visited Marblehead during his farewell tour of the United States. During his 1789 inaugural tour of the United States, President George Washington visited Marblehead to thank the people for their service and sacrifices and to visit his friend John Glover. When we tell the story of the American Revolution, we often focus on great ideas: liberty, natural rights, independence, self-governance. We remember the speeches, the documents, the famous victories. The revolutions do not survive on ideas alone. They survive because, at critical moments, ordinary people do extraordinary things. 3 times when the American Revolution stood on the brink of collapse, it was not rescued by grand strategy or overwhelming force. It was rescued by men who've often since been forgotten, by extraordinary skill and dedication, by ordinary men and women, by discipline, by commitment, by men who knew how to work together in darkness, in silence, in storms. Men whose lives had already taught them that survival depends on trusting the person beside you. By men who'd received promises that sometimes were not kept. The Marblehead men were sailors before they were soldiers. They were fishermen, dock workers, shipbuilders, black, white, free, enslaved, Native American, bound not by ideology, but by experience and a passion for the sea. When Washington needed men who could move an army across a river without sound, men who could hold off a superior force with stone walls and nerve, men who could wrestle boats through ice and blizzard in the dead of winter, he did not hesitate. He called them Marblehead men, brave, hard-working men from a rocky little seaport who knew how to get things done. They asked no questions. They made no speeches. They simply went to work. Because of them, the Continental Army survived to fight another day. Because of them, the revolution continued and a great nation was created. The legacy of the Marblehead men is the survival of the American experiment itself. This has been a project of Alexander Love, National Society Daughters of the American Revolution in Houston for the E Pluribus Unum Committee. Thank you for watching.